I was 9 years old, the first time I noticed my parents treated my sister, Celia, and me differently. It was Christmas Eve, a night usually filled with laughter and warmth. I remember Celia unwrapping a brightly coloured package with a brand new art set inside paints, coloured pencils, fine brushes, and a fancy wooden case, while I got a dull pink diary from the discount store. I recall feeling a pang of hurt, but I convinced myself I was being ungrateful. After all, I'd received something, hadn't I? But year after year, these little discrepancies only grew. They weren't always about physical presence. Sometimes it was a soft word for Celia, and a cold glance for me, a cheer for her accomplishments, and a mild shrug for mine. Even as a child, I could sense something was off, though I lacked the language or courage to put my observations into words. Yet I never stopped hoping that one day I would rise in my parents' esteem. Maybe if I worked a little harder in school, or showed them how helpful I could be around the house, I'd be recognized for my efforts. But as we grew older, Celia blossomed into a bright social butterfly, sweeping every room with her charismatic smile, while I remained quietly in the background. Our parents adored Celia's outgoing nature. They doted on her, took her advice seriously, and praised her for everything from her successes in debate club to her minor roles in school plays. My own accomplishments, straight A's, a spot on the track team, were met with tepid nods or an obligatory clap on the shoulder. Over time, I became resigned, taking on the role of the overshadowed daughter who tried not to let her heart break too visibly. As the years rolled on, Celia got married first. Her wedding was the social event of the season, a grand affair in a mansion on the outskirts of town. My parents paid for everything, the caterers, the elaborate floral arrangements, even the honeymoon to an exclusive resort in Italy. Meanwhile, when I decided to marry my college sweetheart, Raymond, it was a modest gathering in our local church. I wasn't upset about the simplicity. I'd never desired a flashy show. What stung was my parents' lack of enthusiasm. They barely contributed, sending us a small check for the reception, and then vanishing from the planning process as though I were an acquaintance whose party they might drop by if they had time. They never made the wedding day about me. And still, I tried to be the bigger person. My marriage to Raymond, I'll admit, did not spark instant fireworks for my parents. He came from a working-class background, had endured foster care for part of his childhood, and lacked the luxurious trappings my sister's wealthy husband possessed. But I knew Raymond was a wonderful human being, steadfast, loving, and deeply loyal. He never wavered in supporting my dreams. Together, we found ourselves welcomed by Raymond's side of the family, who, despite their humble means, radiated genuine warmth. I hoped that becoming parents ourselves might thaw the ice in my relationship with Mum and Dad. When we had our first child, Amelia, I cautiously hoped a grandchild might soften them. They seemed thrilled enough to meet her on the surface. But in time, that flicker of affection faded into a sense of obligation, as though they visited only when convention demanded. All along, Celia was busy living her life of comfort. She and her husband, Parker, travelled often, collecting exotic photos and posting them on social media. They had 2 children of their own, blonde, lovely, and photogenic, often featured in my parents' living room photos. Meanwhile, pictures of Amelia were relegated to a corner shelf, if they were displayed at all. And if my second daughter, Hazel, was mentioned, it was only as an afterthought. The distance between my parents and me grew, a chasm made of disappointment, heartbreak, and silent grudges. Yet each time they called or asked me to do something like help them move furniture, pick up items from the store, or babysit my sister's kids, I never refused. There was a lingering desire in me to be valued, to prove my worth, to finally become the daughter they could love openly. But then, the final break came. My parents planned a huge family trip to Spain, a grand 3-week tour from the cultural marvels of Barcelona to the tranquil beaches of the Canary Islands. They mentioned it to me in passing, describing it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience for the whole family, an opportunity for new memories. My hopes soared. I pictured Amelia and Hazel learning about a new culture, tasting different foods, and having quality time with their grandparents. But soon, I noticed a strange tension whenever I brought up the trip. My mother would find an excuse to change the subject, My father would drone on vaguely about scheduling issues. Then, word reached me that plane tickets had been purchased for my parents, Celia, her husband, and their 2 children, and not a single ticket for mine. I confronted my mother directly, calling her on a calm weekday afternoon. "Mom," I asked, "are Amelia and Hazel invited to Spain or not?" Her tone turned uncomfortable. "You know, things are complicated, dear. Celia and Parker have already made arrangements that fit nicely with ours. We only booked a certain number of tickets. We have to consider budgets and whatnot. And it's going to be a hectic trip. Also, your children might be too young to properly enjoy the museums and tours." My voice trembled. "They're hardly babies anymore, Mum. Amelia is 9, Hazel is 7. They're at perfect ages to appreciate a trip like this." She dismissed me with an airy sigh. "It's done, all right? We can't just add people to the itinerary now. These things are very delicate. Maybe next year. Let's not make a fuss." A fuss? My heart thundered in my chest. I pictured my daughters' excited faces. I had already told them about the possibility of Spain. They were especially thrilled at the idea of seeing flamenco dancers and eating tapas in Barcelona. Now I'd have to tell them their grandparents chose not to include them. Rather than let tears swallow my voice, I told my mother calmly, "I understand perfectly. You've excluded me and my children. I hope you enjoy your trip." Then I hung up. In that moment, something broke inside me, a brittle piece of hope I'd carried for too long. I realized I had no desire to keep dancing for their scraps of affection. Gone were the illusions that if I did enough, if my children were perfect enough, my parents would embrace us. My phone calls with them became sporadic over the next few weeks, then non-existent. They went to Spain with Celia and her family. I saw photos online of them beaming near Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, of my parents laughing under the Spanish sun with Celia's children wrapped around their arms. None of them tried to contact me. The bitterness in my heart grew until it pressed against my ribs, a physical ache. One day, I scrolled through social media, mindlessly reading updates. Celia, as usual, posted curated photos of her life, champagne brunches, beach getaways, her children's fancy private school recitals. She never missed a chance to portray a flawless family image. And there, I saw a post from my mother, blessed to spend the weekend with the grandchildren who appreciate us. #family first, #love my grandkids. A spark ignited in me. Anger, hurt, the fervor to defend myself and my children. I knew I had to do more than hide away in silence. If I wanted my own sense of justice, my revenge. In a way, I needed to reveal the truth, not just for me, but for Amelia and Hazel, who deserved to know they weren't the problem. What followed was a process of gathering courage, gathering evidence, gathering every single slight, every bit of hypocrisy. I compiled texts, emails, or receipts that proved how my parents had consistently, over the years, shorted me or conveniently ignored my needs. At first, Raymond was concerned. He worried I was stuck in an unhealthy obsession. But when I showed him the extent of my parents' duplicity, even he had to admit that exposing their lies wasn't just petty vengeance. It was self-preservation. He and I decided we wouldn't remain silent while they tried to sabotage my reputation. So I called a family meeting. I crafted carefully worded invitations to my aunts, uncles, and cousins, people who knew parts of the family story but had rarely heard my side. The meeting would be at our home, a comfortable place for me, with plenty of space. I included my parents and Celia, though I doubted they'd come, but to my surprise, they agreed. It was likely they believed I was summoning them to beg for forgiveness, or present a half-baked apology to end our estrangement. Celia, in particular, sent a smug text. "Glad you're ready to talk about your childish behavior." I saved that message. It would come in handy. The day of the meeting, my nerves were on edge. My house was filled with a swirl of voices, my relatives greeting each other, nibbling on snacks, casting glances around the living room. My parents arrived in stiff silence, my father looking dour, my mother wearing a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Celia strutted in last, looking bored and exasperated, as though she had something much better to do. I took a deep breath, praying for the composure to see this through. Then, with the rapt attention of about 20 people, I began. Thank you all for coming, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I know you've heard bits and pieces about a rift in our family. Perhaps you've heard rumors that I've lost my mind or become distant for no reason. I paused, letting the tension build. My parents shifted in their seats, my mother's face growing tight. Let me clarify, I love this family. But for most of my life, my love has been overshadowed by the preferential treatment Celia has received from our parents. This reached a breaking point when my parents decided to exclude my daughters, Amelia and Hazel, from a recent trip to Spain, choosing only Celia's children to join. They didn't even inform me until after the tickets were purchased. And when I tried to address it, I was brushed off, called dramatic, ungrateful. A murmur rippled through the room. My father jumped to his feet. That trip was complicated. We had budget limitations. I held up my hand, scanning the gathered faces. I want you all to see the real messages. I turned on a projector, connecting my phone to display screenshots of the text messages. There, in bold black and white, were my mother's words. It's done, all right? We can't just add people to the itinerary now these things are delicate. And my father's text, calling me dramatic, as always. Then Celia's message, telling me to get over it. My voice broke slightly as I continued. They have spread rumors in our church and among friends that I'm unstable, that I'm somehow turning my children against their grandparents. But the truth is, my children were never even considered worthy of that trip. It's not the first time. I have countless stories of them forgetting birthdays, skipping school events, leaving my children out of family holiday photos. And I'm done letting them rewrite the story of who I am and who my children are. I showed more evidence. A collage of moments, photos my parents posted of Celia's children, with captions about how they had the best grandkids in the world. And next to it, a small, obscure shot of Hazel's birthday party that they never bothered to attend. The hush in the room was heavy. A few aunts exchanged shocked looks. My mother was sputtering, and my father's face had turned beet red with fury. Celia tried to jump in. Oh, come on. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're just piling on old grudges. Are you seriously upset about a few pictures and some silly texts? None of it is silly, I replied, my voice growing stronger. It's a pattern of neglect. And it's not just me. They have neglected my children too. I'm sharing all of this because it's time you all know why I've chosen to cut them off. My parents have the right to favour Celia if they want, but they don't get to smear me in the process or pretend my children deserve less. At this point, my mother's composure cracked. She rose, hands shaking, tears welling in her eyes. We only ever wanted the best for you, she said, her voice drenched in a peculiar mix of fury and desperation. You're turning everyone against us. This is so cruel. You want to talk about cruelty? I asked, forcing my tears to remain at bay. Is it cruel to show the truth? Is it cruel to defend my daughters after you systematically excluded them from their own grandparents' family vacation? Is it cruel to finally stand up for myself and refuse to be used anymore? No one spoke. The tension was almost unbearable. My mother sat back down, pressing her trembling lips together. My father glared at me, but he said nothing, seeming at a loss for words. Then I switched off the projector. The silence stretched on, thick and charged. When I felt like everyone had grasped the weight of the situation, I delivered my final words. I'm not asking for pity, I said, trying to steady my voice. I don't want your sympathy. I simply want you to know why I can't and won't subject my kids to this anymore. I'm done enabling them to treat me like an afterthought, and my kids like second-class citizens. From now on, we're done unless my parents choose to take responsibility and show true remorse for what they've done. Until that day, if it ever comes, we're better off alone. There was a collective exhale. My older relatives, some teary-eyed, some visibly shaken, began whispering among themselves. I didn't anticipate them all taking my side, but I felt relieved that, at the very least, my truth was out in the open. I'd confronted my parents' narrative, exposed their manipulations, and refused to bear the blame. That, in itself, felt like a triumph. It wasn't immediate gratification. There was no glorious day where everyone united behind me, leaving my parents in the dust. But gradually, I noticed a shift, less hush-hush talk around me, more open acknowledgement that my parents had behaved poorly. Some folks reached out with sympathy or offers of help. Others said they respected my bravery. And, most importantly, my parents began to lose their grip on the social narrative. They couldn't keep painting me as unstable when the evidence so starkly contradicted that claim. But the final, triumphant twist came months later. I was working in my home office, preparing lesson plans for the preschool where I taught, when I received an unexpected knock at the door. My mother stood on the porch, tearful and alone. This was the first time I'd seen her face to face since the family meeting. My heartbeat surged, but I kept my expression neutral as I opened the screen door. She looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed, her usually coiffed hair undone. She said in a cracked voice, "May I come in?" I hesitated. Then, quietly, I stepped aside. "Just for a minute," I said, my guard firmly in place. She sat at my kitchen table, hands clasped, her gaze wandering to the family photos on my wall. Pictures of Amelia and Hazel, framed diplomas for the awards they'd won, and snapshots of Raymond and me. It was as though she was seeing my life for the first time. "I've done a lot of thinking," she began slowly. "I've been a terrible mother to you." She paused, swallowing. "And to your children. I realize I always favored Celia, but I never saw it as favoritism. She was louder, more demanding. I thought you were so independent that you didn't need me. But maybe that was a justification, an excuse. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm just apologizing." In that moment, a whirlwind of emotions battered me. My immediate instinct was to lash out, to demand. "Why now? Did you come because you lost face among the extended family? Are you just trying to salvage your image?" But the raw vulnerability in her voice stopped me. This was a side of my mother I'd never seen, someone who, perhaps, was truly reckoning with her failures. "I don't know if I can trust you," I said at last. "And to be honest, I'm not sure I want to." She nodded, tears forming again. "I understand, but I'm asking you to consider letting me try. I miss my daughter. I miss my grandkids." My mind drifted to the many times I'd yearned for this moment. A real apology, an acknowledgement that they'd caused harm. Yet now that it was here, it wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined. The scars ran too deep, the fractures too many. "I can't give you an answer right away," I said softly. "I need time." She stood, her posture stooped, as though bracing for a final blow. "I will wait. And I'll work on myself. I promise." She hesitated before adding, "Thank you for letting me speak." Then, quietly, she left. Raymond saw my turmoil. He took my hand one night as we lay in bed, the moonlight painting silver streaks across our quilt. "Listen," he said, "you've endured so much from them. I'll stand by you no matter what you choose. If you want to give your mother a chance, I'll support that, but only if you do it with healthy boundaries. If you decide you can't open that door, I'll support that too." I thanked him, pressing my cheek against his chest. "I just worry about letting her in and having it all happen again," I whispered. The disappointment. It was so excruciating. He ran a hand gently through my hair. "I know, but you've already reclaimed your power once. You can do it again, if you need to. You're stronger now. You're not the same woman who was silently enduring. And you've got the truth on your side." And that, in a strange way, became a final piece of my revenge, the knowledge that I had shattered their hold over me. My father and Celia, in their pride and stubbornness, were left behind. My mother had chosen a different path, one that forced her to see me as an autonomous person deserving of respect. I didn't always trust her intentions, but with time, I softened, letting her see slivers of my life. Because the real revenge was never about humiliating them publicly, though part of me had wanted that for a while. It was about me reclaiming my story, living with the confidence that I was worthy, and protecting my children. By asserting boundaries and exposing the truth, I stopped a cycle of manipulation and neglect. My mother's apology and attempts to mend our relationship were a side effect, a sign that the scales had tipped in my favor. But the greatest satisfaction was in the peace I found, the confidence in my own decisions, and the unwavering support of the family I built with Raymond. And in the end, justice didn't look like a triumphant crowd cheering me on, nor a swift comeuppance for my parents. Justice was found in the quiet resolution to never again let myself or my children be treated as lesser. It was in the knowledge that love, true love, doesn't withhold or punish. It was in discovering that my husband, my daughters, and I could create our own circle of belonging with or without my parents. Now, whenever I see old family portraits, my parents and Celia all smiling, with me tucked away in the corner, I feel a bittersweet pang. I remember that quiet little girl who learned early on that she wasn't cherished. And then I remind myself of the woman I've become, one who has faced the heartbreak, bared it for all to see, and stood her ground. My past does not dictate my future. My children will grow up knowing they deserve to be seen, loved, and included. Yes, I cut off my parents, at least the father I once revered and the mother I once idolized. But in time, I found a new version of my mother, one who was genuinely remorseful, though deeply flawed. With boundaries firmly in place, we are inching toward a more honest relationship. I'm not foolish enough to believe we'll ever be the perfect family, but I've reclaimed my dignity, reclaimed my narrative, and found real support in the people who choose me wholeheartedly. That, I believe, is more powerful than any grand act of revenge. I tell this story now not to wallow in bitterness, but to illustrate that sometimes the most dramatic revenge is simply refusing to be diminished. Sometimes it's forcing the truth into the light and allowing those who have wronged you to face it publicly, privately, however it must be done. And sometimes it's granting forgiveness on your own terms, with your heart guarded but open enough to let in the possibility of change. My children have learned through my example that they never have to beg for someone's love. They are worthy unconditionally. And as I watch them grow into strong, compassionate, and confident young people, I feel my own battered heart heal. In the end, the greatest satisfaction lies not in punishing those who hurt us, but in ensuring their cruelty never has the power to shape our lives again. That is how I found justice. That is how I found peace. And that is how I finally found the strength to stop dancing for approval and begin living for myself.